This video is brought to you by Dr. Kristen R. Bromley's Guitar Method Book Series and Online Music Academy.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kristen Bromley. Welcome to my online academy. It's so great to have you joining me here in these online lessons. It's a Theory Thursday. I love music theory and I'm so delighted to bring this course to you. In this lesson, we're going to go over an overview of the different types of scales there are that we play on the guitar. And then as the lessons continue, the next several Theory Thursday lessons, we'll go over how we can play some of the more common modes and scales on the guitar, sort of in the best way possible. So best practice for doing so. But before I go into those specific lessons, I really wanted to do an overview so you kind of have an idea of the different types of scales that exist that we play on the guitar, so you kind of have that knowledge to draw from. Of course, in the last several Theory Thursday lessons, we've been going over different types of chords, how to create chord progressions, how some of those chords relate to different scales or modes, that sort of thing. I haven't gone into a lot of technical voicings yet on the Theory Thursday course, and that's because there's other lesson series on the channel that have covered a lot with playing the different types of chords. So of course, there's the strumming and learning the chords early on, beginner guitar lessons that cover sort of the basic ones in first position. There's lessons that help with bar chords and that sort of thing. And the jazz lessons series goes over so many of those, 7th, 13th, 9th, sharp 11, 11, all those different types of chords that we've been talking about recently are covered. Some of the best ways to play those are covered in the jazz course, and those lessons have come out recently. So I'm jumping over to modes because I don't want to have similar lessons coming out over the different series at the same time. And then after we've done these modes, we can go back and look at how to play some voicings, and I'll be able to approach it maybe different than it is covered in those other lesson series. So if you want help with voicings on 7th chords and that sort of thing, you can check out those jazz lessons that have that for you. But we're going to talk through scales. So when we're talking about a scale, what we're really talking about is how we're going to divide the octave, and there's lots of different ways that we can do it. So the octave, as you know, and if you don't know about the intervals, you can check out the Theory Thursday lesson that goes over intervals, where I discuss how we have different intervals that explain the distance between different pitches, and we talk about that there, so you can check that out. But the octave is where we have one note or sound that happens in a higher or lower range, and we can have multiple octaves. On the guitar, we have multiple occurrences of this E note, for example. Here's an octave higher, here's an octave higher, here's an octave higher. So right there we have 4 different octaves of that E note. But the octave is where that pitch or that sound reoccurs. And when we're talking about a scale, we're talking about ways that we can divide that octave into stepwise motion. I use stepwise motion very loosely here because technically when we're talking about a step, we're talking about a whole step or a half step. And we know from that lesson on intervals that a half step is 1 fret apart, so the adjacent frets are a half step apart. And then when we skip over a fret, we have a whole step. Our most traditional scales, like the chromatic scale and the major scale and the modes that come out of the major scale, they have all whole steps and half steps. But as we start getting into other types of scales, we actually have notes that go further apart than that. And it's stepwise in the scale, but intervallically speaking, it would be considered a skip to our ears because it goes further than a whole step. But we get those inside of the different scales that we play. So the foundational scale, and the very first Theory Thursday lesson I ever did was about the chromatic scale. So we got that one up here on the board. I have these terms that we're going to go over. These terms sort of cover the different types of scales that we play on the guitar, that can be played on the guitar, and that exist. And there are hundreds and hundreds. But understanding just the categories can be really helpful as we start moving forward and learning some of these. So the chromatic scale, I covered this extensively right early on in the course because it helps us learn what all the notes are and how the guitar is sort of functioning. It works through the chromatic scale. But we have that octave and we have the chromatic scale. We're going to divide it into 12 equally distanced steps, half steps. So we just go right up that chromatic scale when we move 1 fret at a time. We can go ascending or descending. And we we've got the chromatic scale. And if you want to know more about playing that chromatic scale, check out those other Theory Thursday lessons. They're early on, towards the beginning of the course and at the very beginning of the course. Discuss how we can play them on the guitar on one string and then crossing the strings. And that helps us understand. So the chromatic scale, and there's only one of those, includes all the pitches that exist on the guitar, all 12 pitches. So we've divided it equally into half steps, 12 steps. So that's the chromatic scale. Everything else has less pitches, and we're going to be missing some of the notes that exist in the chromatic scale. Heptatonic scales are our 7-note scales, and this is really where our foundational scales are for the music that we tend to play on guitar, because the major scale, which is probably the most commonly known scale that exists besides this chromatic scale amongst just music players in general, is that major scale. It has 7 notes, and we know that in playing that one, we've got the whole step. I'll just do it here in B flat. We've got a whole step, and then a half step, a whole step, whole step, whole step, and then a half step. And that's how we divide that octave, and then we've gotten to that octave. So I just played that in B flat. My middle finger was at the 6th fret on that 6th string. Now, early on in the course, I gave extensive coverage of the very best way that you can master the neck, understanding that major scale. The first position, and then how we use movable shapes all over the fretboard. I also have a theory and technique book, the 2nd edition, which is coming out, which extensively goes over the hundreds of scales that exist. It's pretty incredible, pretty remarkable. It's really, really an extensive coverage. I can't cover that here, and the book really just kind of opens your mind to the different sounds that you could use. And when we're using scales, we're using them to play melodies, we're using them to improvise melodies or compose melodies. It's just that as we have this collection of pitches, it helps us put them into a space where we can use the different pitches in sort of a, I want to say, usable way, or a way that makes sense, a way that brings all the different musical elements together, the chords, the chord progressions, and the melodies. So scales are really foundational that way. They also help us develop playing technique and so on. So knowing scales is really great. Starting with that major scale is important. So check out those lessons on playing in the first position and then how the movable scale system works. Everything that we do with any of these other scales in the next several lessons will sort of use the same sort of formula that I went through very extensively, several lessons worth in those first lessons where I covered the major scale on the Theory Thursday lessons. So you want to check those out. Now, we know the heptatonic scales. We've learned a little bit when we were working through chords that there's different modes. So I've got that major scale, but if I start on a different step, if I start on step 2, for example, I get a different modal sound, and that's the Dorian mode coming off step 2 of that major scale, and then step 3 I'm going to get a different sound, or step 4 I'm going to get a different sound, and so on and so forth, and we get different modes. Well, there are 7 different modes that work with that major scale, and then there's other types of scales that are different than the major scale that have 7 steps that also then have 7 modes. So pretty cool. We'll be getting into some of that. Of course, my theory and technique book that will be coming out very soon covers them extensively, way more than I could ever cover, because there's hundreds and hundreds of these scales. But heptatonic scales are sort of the foundation, that 7-note scale, that major scale. So much of our music revolves around that, and then correlating minor scales. So from there, we've got pentatonic scales. These are usually pretty familiar to us as guitarists. There's 5 notes, and we have a major pentatonic. Right now, we're working on the Saturday lessons that come out, which are improvising in blues, pop, and rock styles. That's the lesson series that's happening. We're using major pentatonic and minor pentatonic scales to improvise. So those are 5-note scales. 5-note scales, pentatonic, 5-note scales, and they actually directly overlap with our heptatonic scales. We're just missing 2 notes. So you're going to have modes that exist with these as well, and we'll learn about some of those modes, but they directly overlap with modes minus 2 notes from the heptatonic scales. Pretty cool. We also have hexatonic scales, 6-note scales. Some of the more common 6-note scales that we might be familiar with are taking our pentatonic scales and having an extra note that creates the blues scale. So, for example, there in B flat, if I played my minor pentatonic scale, and then I add that extra note, that sharp 4 or flat 5, that creates that blues scale. The blues scales are a hexatonic scale. There's also other scales that are hexatonic, like the whole tone scale. We've learned about dividing the octave by all half steps. We can divide the octave by all whole steps. And we get the whole tone scale, all whole tones, all whole steps, all whole tones, and that takes 6 steps and we've completed that octave. That's also a hexatonic scale. Besides those, we've got octatonic scales. These are 8-note scales. I should go back. With hexatonic scales, we generally think of some of them, not necessarily the whole tone scale, but the other ones as being 1 extra note added to a pentatonic scale or 1 missing note from the heptatonic scales. That's usually how we associate those in our mind, other than that whole tone scale where it's just easier to think, oh, it's all whole steps. So we've got the octatonic scales, which are 8-note scales. The easiest way to associate these is in a couple different ways. One is that they are just like heptatonic scales, but we've added 1 extra note. An example of this is bebop scales that we use in jazz, where I just, for example, play that major scale, flat 7, natural 7, and then the octave. So compared to a mixolydian mode, which is like a major scale with a minor 7th or a flatted 7th, I just added the major 7th to the scale. Or compared to the major scale, I just added the flatted 7th in there and have that little chromatic. So there's lots of octatonic scales or 8-note scales that have an additional note compared to the heptatonic scales. There's also octatonic scales that exist where we're not really thinking of them that way. We're thinking of them as a collection of whole step and half steps intertwined. So I've got it down here at the bottom of the board, symmetrical scales. That's where we use a pattern. Our chromatic scale has 12 half steps. Everything's a half step. That's symmetrical. Our whole tone scale is a symmetrical scale. Everything's a whole step. So that's a symmetrical scale. We've got a couple of these octatonic scales where we're alternating half step and whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, and we get those. In that case, I'm starting with a half step, whole step, and just continuing. Or I could do it the other way. And so we get these diminished scales, which are considered symmetrical because they're alternating half step and whole step all the way through. So that's a symmetrical pattern. We create this symmetrical pattern. So those are the common octatonic scales. Those diminished scales are really, really familiar. Sometimes that whole step, half step one is talked about as the octatonic scale, but there's actually other 8-note scales as well. So, but sometimes it's referred to as the octatonic scale. Tetrachords are 4-note scale, 4 notes. They just have 4 notes. And these 4 notes can be used to create chords. They can also be used, and these are stepwise, to combine together to create interesting scales as well. So I put those up there. They include 4 notes, just a collection of 4 notes. We can use those to make larger scales. We can use those to make chords. They're used in sort of an interesting way. So there's our overview of the different types of scales. Now on the guitar, it really helps to have sort of a system for playing scales, and I went over that extensively with the major scale. For example, we can have 1 octave, and we can then learn to play that on other strings. We can learn to play that along 1 string. We can connect them together, we can get all over the neck, but the scale system opens the fretboard up for us. And then of course we can learn things in first position where we're really just memorizing where those notes are. Understanding scales helps us with note reading, and my note reading, books 1 and 2 help with learning those notes in first position. Note reading book 3 helps you master the fretboard with the major scale and then the correlating minor scale and just learning to read, and then with the chromatic scale as well. all over the fretboard, and that really opens things up. Learning that major scale first is super important. So if you haven't checked out those Theory Thursday lessons where I go over the scale system with the major scale, you're probably going to want to check that out before we start getting into all the modes that I'll start looking at next week. But also, learning the scales can just help us understand the music that we're playing better, and it gets our hands and the dexterity going, gets our fingers flowing with different melodic sounds. It can also help to do scale patterns. I've gone over some great scale patterns on those Technique Tuesday lessons that can help you develop the hand motion. So scales are super important. Here on the Theory Thursday lessons, we're going to be exploring them from understanding them from a theoretical standpoint, and then fretboard theory-wise, how we play them on the guitar. It's going to be so awesome. So next Thursday, we're going to go over the modes of the major scale. Since I've covered the major scale so extensively already on Theory Thursday lessons, we're going to look at just the modes and how we can get 7 different scales coming with those modes using that same system that I've already explained in several different lessons, because it's pretty extensive. I go into great detail on it, but that's where we're going to be starting with the next Theory Thursday lesson, and then we'll be going through some of the more common of these scales that we play and how we can play them on the guitar in the Theory Thursday lessons to come. So lots of great work with modes and scales that we're going to be doing here on these Theory Thursday lessons through this next several weeks as we go over modes, which is going to be exciting. Of course, we've got jazz lessons coming out on Mondays. On Saturdays right now, we're working on improvising in those rock, pop, and blues styles, actually using a lot with the pentatonic scales. So pretty cool. Keep checking out these lessons. There's over 1,000 videos on the channel, actually. So lots of places to get great help with all sorts of different techniques and playing. Super, super fun. So keep having fun. Take care, and we'll see you again.
If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. For more in-depth lessons and to progress through a free guitar course, check out my Guitar 101 series on YouTube and my guitar method books, which all come with access to hours of in-depth video lessons. You can find more information about me and my products at kristenbromley.com. Take care.